Hey woodworkers, welcome back. I wanted to talk about spray finishes and more specifically tools for applying finishes via spraying. A couple of things to consider whenever you're doing finishing, and I know this is repetitive, but personal safety and protection. So always having a respirator, always having at the very least eye protection, so if there's any splashing when you're mixing and pouring these things in, it doesn't get into your eyes. And then obviously gloves for all of the stuff. If you've done that, then you're probably 95% of the way there. The other thing that I recommend is having some type of a longer sleeve, something or other, so that when this stuff becomes atomized, it doesn't glob onto your clothes and then you're smelling this all day long. If you're going to talk to clients or going home to your family, that could be a disaster. So, all right, so personal protection and safety is tantamount to all of this. Okay, so I have three different examples of guns or options for spraying. The first gun here is a turbine system, and we'll talk about the difference between that. And then we have an HVLP system. Both of these qualify as HVLP. This one works off compressed air. So if you have a large enough compressor, plug this thing in, you could spray, and this is great. And a lot of people opt for this. Third option, which a lot of people swear by, but I think it's specific to the type of finish you're applying, but you could use a pressure pot like this one. And so with a pressure pot, you could dump your finish in here, mix it up, and then connect a hose to a gun. And it's always under pressure at this point, and then you have the driving force for moving those particles through the gun out into the air and land on your finish. The one downside to a pressure pot, in my estimation, is that in that hose that goes from wherever your finish is to your gun, all of that is going to be full of finish, and so that becomes a problem if you're using something that's has a catalytic effect or conversion that will start to solidify in that hose, and you can ruin your system in a hurry. Something like nitrocellulose lacquer, shellac, any of those things you can leave in here because it's going to reactivate when that solvent starts to run through it. So this is an option. A lot of people swear by this. For me, I think it's a bit of a hassle and not totally in keeping with the type of finishing I do. Okay, so that leaves us two options. So with these two types of guns, you'll notice that there are differences where the material is being stored. So with this particular gun, this is referred to as a gravity feed. That means that when you pull back on this trigger, that's going to open up a little valve here. The air pressure is going to mix with that, and it's going to start to spread as it needs to. The other one is a siphon feed. So the cup here is on the bottom of the gun. Some people prefer this. I think the majority of new professional finishers go in this realm for one big reason. Number one is if I'm spraying this piece of OSB, for reasons I'll never understand why I would want to put a finish on, but as you're spraying, the concern is that the bottom edge of this cup will drag on that finish. And so that's a concern. If there's no finish there, it could still potentially scratch or damage. So you'd have to stop, repair that part, and then revisit. I've been using these forever and ever and ever, and I'm very fond of them. So this is my go-to. This one, I think, I certainly understand the point, just a different method. All right, so with a gravity-fed system, there's not a whole lot to this. There are parts and pieces that we should discuss. Actually, let me zoom in for this because you really don't need to see me, but this is what you came here for, I'm guessing. All right. So we have this thing here. This is referred to as the tip. This is what determines how much material is broadcast at whatever point. The thing to note about all finishes is that anything could be sprayed through a gun as far as a finish goes, assuming it can be diluted enough. So the the tip size is going to be important for what we're doing, because the smaller the tip here, it makes the smaller particles that will broadcast onto your finish, and it's a little bit more consistent. It's a very clean, very small particulate that we would typically want to be spraying on our finishes. Things like house painting and all that, it's a larger solid content, so we would want a larger tip size because it needs to push that material out through a larger opening and then land on wherever it needs to go. The trade-off is going to be, if you wanted to force a thicker material through a smaller tip, you would just need more power. So if you up the pressure on your compressor or dial it into our pressure gauge here, then you could push some things. Same situation exists with the turbine, but you just need a larger system, more fans basically on a turbine. So, okay, so the tip size here, what I would recommend for most clear finishes for woodworking is somewhere in the neighborhood of a 1.2, 1.4, something like that is kind of the general range of what we're after. Even going down to just a 1.0 tip is not bad, depending on what it is you're getting into. Okay, so I remove the tip here, and disassembling this, there's a little pin that is also part of the process for distributing finish, and they don't make it easy to get to. It's going to be worth the wait. All right, so I'm not strong. Oh, I am strong enough. All right, so this pin here, this is important to be aware of when we are spraying finishes. Air pressure is going to go through here. When we pull back on the trigger, that brings this pin back from where it's spraying. By doing so, it allows finish to flow through that little opening now. So it's this system where the pin is constantly in motion. So we're spraying, we pull back, and then we release, goes forward. So we need to make sure that this thing is not going to be bound or caught on anything in that system. And a lot of times, finish could start to adhere to this and just kind of gum up the works. So a Scotch-Brite pad would be an easy thing to clean this thing off with. The next thing that I do with my guns, which is not, it's not my trick, I learned this from a finisher years ago, is we want to have this slightly lubricated. And so it becomes a problem if we're using an oil or a wax to lubricate this, because wax is going to interfere with just about every finish that we want to spray. Oils are only really compatible with other oil-based finishes or something that is mineral spirit solvent-based. So for this, what the recommendation is to use natural oils that exist on our body. And sometimes there are oils between our fingers, sometimes there's oils right here on our nose. My favorite is the one behind your ear. So I do this little thing, which looks crazy. It looked crazy when I saw it, but we can do that. And then at this point, this action is now not limited. And then replacing this, that spring is in place to make sure that that trigger goes back to where we want it. And I would really hate to cross thread this. Okay. So now that that's in place, reassembling these things, the tip, now I've done it. 31. I'll definitely not edit that out in post, although that would be really great if I could. Okay, so now we're reassembled here, and I could pull this thing back and forth. Based on how far I thread that little pin into place is going to limit or open up how much action there is on this trigger. And that means more material is coming out the further back that pin is. If I were to bring this further forward, then I have less travel in that gun, and that means less material. There's less of that pin being removed so that material can flow out of this. So we want to find the sweet spot for what it is we're doing. If again, I'm broadcasting this material on a large surface like this, I would want to have a lot of material coming out and being distributed here. If I were to really scale this thing back, then I'm going to get a very small amount of material here, very thin coats. And then, so that's the methodology with this. This second knob here, this one will advance or decrease the fan pattern of this gun. So if I open this thing up quite a bit, I'm going to have a really wide fan pattern, which makes sense here. If I conversely scale it back, then it's going to be fairly narrow. And all right, so that's kind of how we get material in and out of this thing. The other thing is the orientation here of these two wings of this tip. This can be rotated, and it should be rotated so that it follows the pattern of whatever it is you're spraying. So right now, there's going to be air pressure coming out the two sides from these horns or these side pieces. And then that finishing material is going to come out through the center. So what happens is material's coming out here, fans are coming out here to distribute that material where it needs to be. So orientation of this becomes critical because in the vertical orientation here, that fan pattern is going to be horizontal, right? So it's 90 degrees to whatever this thing is doing. So if I'm finishing a table leg or something vertical, I would want to have this go in that orientation because then I can start to spray here. If I were to keep that same fan pattern on a horizontal surface, then my pattern is all wrong for the motion of where this gun is going. So I would want to rotate the fan pattern here so I could really cover this area effectively. And so anyway, doing it this way. Some of these guns have little detents, so you can click into vertical, horizontal. Some of them have a diagonal one that puts a very small little circular or spot pattern in there, which is great for toning effects and possibly touch-up work. So that's the process. You'll notice that this one is going to be difficult to deal with if I have a cup full of finishing products in it. So they have these little brackets that's a stand you can just set this thing into. Hose can still be connected, and then this goes where it needs to go. If I were to set it on the side, that finish would just spill out. That's the issue. All right, so the other style here of gun, you can probably notice a difference with respect to where this clips into the different hoses that provide the air pressure. This is much larger, and that's one of the benefits of the turbine. So a turbine functions very much the same way as what we just talked about with the gravity feed worked off a compressor. Let me pull out the parts here. One thing I like to do on any type of finishing application I'm using, and I guess this is maybe one of the bigger reasons why I prefer this system over a gravity feed, is that right now I have finish in here. I'm doing a polyurethane based finish on this, and so I need to, after I spray whatever I'm going to spray, I need to clear the mechanisms here, make sure that I run solvent through it so that it doesn't cure anywhere in this process, so that I have to strip the whole thing down and manually scrape this stuff off, sometimes chemically. So with having another pot, I could put this in here, click it in, run that material through, and then really open up the volume so I make sure I force it out. And then when I'm done, seal this in here. This protects my finish, and that's what I want for what I'm doing. But then the next thing I will do is I'll disassemble all the parts, and then that lives in the solvent, so that anything that might be stuck, and it's more specific to this little section with the horns, because I don't want any finish to be in there blocking that air pressure. So those just live in that bath. Then the whole point about this flat bottom is I could just set this thing down much easier, and then I don't really have an issue with this thing tipping over. In my finishing location, I also have a section to hook this on so that the hose is hanging down, and this is going to be very, very safe for the next time. Okay, so reassembling this one, not much to it. Spring goes in. Bear with me, I want to make sure we're still in frame. Oh, we are. Lovely. So the spring goes in first. The next piece is going to be this little washer here. And you'll notice when I was talking about those detents before, these are little bearings in there. And those click into the different positions. So, where are you? Oh yeah, there you are. So there's a little notch right here for that little washer to go into. This guy goes in. There we go. And then just thread or screw these things back into place. No, I screwed something up horribly wrong. I think I put the washer in backwards. In fact, I did. Again, one thing that I won't edit out in post, but I definitely should. So just be aware of what's coming. Yeah, it's good. So if I were to lock this all the way in, it's going to be very difficult for me to rotate this, give it a little bit of rotation here, and you can hear me clicking into the different positions. All right, so that's that. Okay, so they work in a very similar format. This adjustment knob here controls how much action I have on this trigger and how much material is going to be coming out. The other thing that you can't see is on the end of the hose, there is a little dial system to choke down how much air pressure is coming through the system. And the air pressure on this turbine system is critical for making sure that I'm not putting too much air into the gun and then blowing this thing out really strong. But it controls it in ways that you have to be able to control. If I were to just, like with this one, let's say there was no pressure regulator here. I just connected this to my air compressor and I'm going 100 pounds or more of air pressure into this. You kind of negate the entire benefit of HVLP systems, pardon me, if I have full pressure, because what happens is there's so much force going out of that gun that it bounces off of whatever you're trying to spray and very little material lands. By being able to scale back the amount of pressure that you need on either one of these guns, then it just gives enough air pressure to really help the material travel from here to there, and then more of what you need lands on where you want it. There's less waste, safer for you because that stuff is now atomized far less than it would ordinarily be. So those are the differences with that. We do need some system of controlling how much material is coming in and out. All right, big differences between these two is with a system that's running off of a compressor. This will work just fine, but with the compression, the process by which compressors work, they pull atomized air out and then they hold onto it under pressure. In doing so, they pull any atmospheric moisture that's in the air. So if you live on the coasts, or Florida would be probably the best example of what not to do with this. That's going to be trapped moisture into your compressor, which is going to start to do bad things to your compressor. But more specific to what we're doing here, if that's not filtered between the compressor and what is we're spraying, you have moist air coming out of here. That's probably not a horrible situation if you're using a water-based finish. Anything else though, the water droplets that are trapped in there are going to mix with your finish and they're not going to blend. So you're gonna have these little spots where water has landed and won't allow the finish to land or to cure in the same way that it needs to. So there's that. With a turbine system, it's not storing any compressed air. It basically has a series of fans that will draw air in, go through the fans, filter it along the way, and then it goes through the hoses to get to where we need it. The big benefit of a turbine system is that that process generates a lot of heat for having that air go through the fans and then coming up into the hose into the system. And in doing so, sometimes it'll start to activate or to help the cure finish a little bit faster. It's not going to change the effects or make it a detriment of whatever your finish is, but it could have a nice effect coming out a little bit warmer than compressed air. So that's the other benefit there. And then there's no contaminants along the way. So we talked about moisture, but sometimes rust. The other thing that happens when we compress air, hold it into a steel container, which air compressors do, that rust will come out. It could start to clog up any of the systems here. That's oxidized metal, that rust stuff. That's going to land in your finish, and then you have to deal with it after the finish cures, which is no fun. And so those are the trade-offs there. So along with the system, you'll need some way of scaling back the pressure that's coming into the gun, and then also you need to filter it. So below this point, you're going to have a moisture filter system, as well as a particulate filter system, so that you are just getting the purest air from compressor as possible. If you don't do that, it's going to start to come back to bite you. With this system, a little bit less of a concern there. They're pricey, so I think the going rate for one of these systems, all in with the hoses and whichever stage of turbine that you would choose, it's all in. It's around $400 to $1,200 is probably the range. And so just this gun is somewhere in the neighborhood of $350, $400. So being aware of that. With the compressed air system, the gun you could easily drop $300, $400 on. The filters you can drop another $100 on, maybe a little bit less. But these are the things you need to consider. If you already have a compressor of some volume, if it's a 30-gallon tank or greater, I think you'll be just fine to spray finishes off of a compressor, assuming you have the proper filtration and something to address the pressure that needs to go through this gun. With this one, it's a little bit more plug and play. It is pricey. Arguably, this one is louder than the other, which might be a factor, but when it gets going, it lets you know that it's working. So anyway, those are the differences. Hopefully that was helpful as a brief introduction. I'm going to set up in another video and show the application of finish through this system here shortly. So good luck with your finishes. This should be a lot of fun.